There is a word buried inside your monthly paycheck. You have never noticed it. Nobody does. It arrives every 2 weeks, deposited silently into accounts, spent on rent and groceries and the small necessities of living. But the word itself is ancient, corroded by time, stained with something that predates currency, predates banking, predates the very concept of an economy built on paper and numbers. The word is salary. It comes from the Latin salarium, the allowance paid to Roman soldiers in salt. Some historians argue the soldiers were paid in salt itself, measured out in coarse gray blocks from the mines of Ostia or the salt pans of the Adriatic coast. Others say it was merely an allowance for the purchase of salt. The debate among scholars continues, but the etymology does not lie. Every time a wage is deposited, every time a contract is signed, every time a human being exchanges labor for money, the ghost of salt is present, silent, invisible, still collecting its fee. Salt. Sodium chloride, NaCl. A molecule so simple, it can be written on the back of a receipt. 2 atoms, 1 sodium, 1 chlorine, bonded through an ionic attraction so fundamental to the chemistry of matter that it forms spontaneously, almost inevitably, as if the universe itself conspired to produce it. And for most of recorded human history, this molecule, this almost embarrassingly simple compound, determined who ate and who starved, who ruled and who was executed, which cities rose and which were erased from maps. It built roads, it financed wars, it rotted the lungs of the men who dug it from the earth and crystallized it from the sea. It sent thousands to prison for the crime of carrying it in their pockets. It salted the wounds of every major empire from Rome to China to pre-revolutionary France, and in doing so, it quietly salted the wounds of the people those empires crushed underfoot. This is not a story about seasoning. This is a story about control. Begin at the edge of everything, before cities, before grain, before the concept of a meal shared between strangers, approximately 8,000 years ago, in what is now the Sichuan province of central China. There existed a place called Yanqi, the salt pool. Early Neolithic communities gathered at the shores of this naturally occurring brine lake, where the evaporation of shallow water left behind crusted white deposits along the mudflats. These were not mining operations in any recognizable sense. There were no shafts, no tunnels, no organized labor. People knelt at the waterline and scraped. That was all. They scraped the white mineral from the mud and carried it home in clay vessels, and in doing so, they performed an act that would echo forward through 8 millennia of human civilization without interruption, because salt does something that no other mineral in the human diet accomplishes in the same way. The human body cannot manufacture sodium. It can store it, regulate it, excrete it, but it cannot produce it. Every nerve impulse that fires in the human brain, every muscle contraction from the heartbeat to the blink of an eye, every fluid exchange between cells depends on the precise balance of sodium ions in the bloodstream. Strip sodium from the body entirely, and the result is hyponatremia, confusion, seizure, coma, death. The biology is not negotiable. Salt is not a preference. Salt is a biological imperative dressed in the costume of a condiment. The earliest human communities understood this not through chemistry. They had no chemistry, but through the raw testimony of their own bodies. Animals sought salt licks in the wild. Hunters followed game to natural mineral deposits. The behavior was encoded in biology long before it was encoded in language or law, but it was the discovery of salt's preservative properties that transformed it from a dietary necessity into an economic weapon. Sometime around 6000 BCE, communities along what is now the Romanian and Bulgarian coast of the Black Sea developed the first known salt works, shallow evaporation pools cut from coastal marshland, designed not merely to harvest salt for immediate consumption, but to produce it in surplus quantities, large enough to preserve meat, fish, and vegetables across seasons. The implications were staggering. Food that would rot within days could now survive weeks, months, entire winters. Protein sources that had previously been consumed immediately at the site of slaughter could now be packed, transported, traded. The nomadic calculus of human survival began to shift. A community with reliable access to salt could store food, A community that could store food could stay in one place longer. A community that stayed in one place longer could build things: granaries, walls, roads, hierarchies. Salt did not create civilization, but it created the conditions that made civilization possible. And like every resource that makes civilization possible, it immediately attracted the attention of the men who wished to own civilization entirely. Egypt understood it first, as Egypt understood most things first. The Nile Delta's vast, shallow marshes along the Mediterranean coast were natural salt pans, immense, sun-drenched flats where the evaporation of seawater deposited white crusts of sodium chloride in quantities that dwarfed anything available inland. The pharaonic administration recognized the strategic value of this resource with the same cold clarity it applied to gold mines and grain stores. Salt production along the delta was placed under direct state control. Workers, many of them conscripted, many of them effectively enslaved, harvested the mineral in brutal conditions, standing knee-deep in brine under the Egyptian sun, their skin cracking and bleeding from constant salt exposure, their respiratory systems slowly destroyed by the fine mineral dust that hung perpetually in the air above the evaporation beds. The salt they produced preserved fish from the Nile. It cured meat for the army. It was used in the embalming process, natron. The specific salt compound used in mummification was a mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate harvested from dry lake beds in the Egyptian desert. Even in death, salt was the instrument of preservation. Even the dead required it. The Romans, who borrowed liberally from Egypt in matters of administration and extraction, built their salt economy along similar lines, but with considerably greater geographic ambition. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, was one of the oldest roads in Italy, running from the salt pans at the mouth of the Tiber near Ostia northeast through the Apennine Mountains and into the interior of the peninsula. This road existed before Rome was an empire. It existed, in fact, before Rome was Rome. The salt trade that moved along it predated the Republic, predated the monarchy, predated nearly everything that would later be called Roman civilization. Rome grew up around a salt road. The legions that eventually conquered most of the known world were paid, fed, and sustained in no small part by salt revenues. The Roman state maintained strict control over salt prices, occasionally distributing salt at fixed low prices to citizens as a form of political patronage, a practice that the Roman historian Livy recorded with the same bureaucratic neutrality one might apply to a grain dole or a water ration. Salt, in Republican Rome, was a civic resource. Under the empire, it became something more sinister, a mechanism of fiscal extraction so deeply embedded in the economy that removing it was unthinkable. China arrived at the same conclusion independently and prosecuted it with even greater ferocity. The Yanjing, the salt administration, was one of the oldest and most sophisticated bureaucratic systems in Chinese history. Archaeological evidence suggests state involvement in salt production dating back to at least the Zhou dynasty, around 1000 BCE. By the Han dynasty, the salt monopoly had become a cornerstone of imperial finance. The economist Song Hongyang, advising Emperor Wu in 119 BCE, formalized the state salt monopoly as a deliberate instrument of fiscal policy. The government would control production, distribution, and pricing, generating revenue sufficient to fund military campaigns against the Xiongnu nomads threatening the northern frontier. The salt merchants who operated within this system, licensed, regulated, taxed at every conceivable point of the supply chain, became some of the wealthiest men in Chinese history. The Huizhou salt merchants of the Ming and Qing dynasties built elaborate mansions in southern Anhui province. Their architectural excess, funded entirely by the margin between the cost of producing salt in coastal Jiangsu and the price at which they were permitted to sell it inland. They were, in the most literal sense, men who had transmuted a mineral into architecture, a molecule into marble. But the men who actually produced the salt, the workers at the coastal salt farms, the miners in Sichuan's subterranean brine wells, the laborers who operated the bamboo pipes that carried underground salt water to surface boiling houses. Those men lived and died in conditions that the salt merchants' ledgers recorded only as a production cost. In the Sichuan salt industry, workers descended into wells that reached depths of over 1,000 meters by the Song dynasty. an engineering achievement of extraordinary sophistication, accomplished without explosives, without electric light, without any of the safety equipment that modern mining takes for granted. They drilled through solid rock using weighted bamboo percussion tools, a technique refined over centuries. They worked in complete darkness, broken only by oil lamps. When the brine flooded the shaft, as it sometimes did, without warning, the men inside drowned before anyone above ground understood what had happened. Their deaths were recorded, if they were recorded at all, as a line item in a production report. The salt came up regardless. If China perfected the salt monopoly as an instrument of imperial finance, France perfected it as an instrument of class warfare. The gabelle, the French salt tax, was not a single coherent policy. It was an accretion of centuries of royal desperation, fiscal improvisation, and aristocratic exemption that had grown so complex, so internally contradictory, and so grotesquely unjust by the 18th century that even the officials tasked with enforcing it could not always determine what the law actually required. The origins of the gabelle lay in the 14th century. Philip IV, Philip the Fair, a king whose nickname history bestowed with considerable irony, introduced a salt tax in 1286 as a temporary measure to fund military campaigns. Temporary measures in the hands of desperate monarchs have a way of becoming permanent. By the reign of Charles VI in the early 1400s, the gabelle had solidified into a structural feature of French royal finance, and it remained there, accreting layers of exemptions, special provisions, and regional variations for the next 4 centuries. The mechanism was specific and deliberately punitive. In regions classified as grandes gabelles, primarily northern and central France, every household was legally required to purchase a minimum annual quantity of salt from the government salt warehouses, called greniers à sel. This mandatory purchase was called the sel du devoir, the salt of duty. You did not have to want the salt, you did not have to need the salt, you were required to buy it. A family that had already salted its provisions for the year, a widow living alone with no livestock to cure and no fish to preserve, a tenant farmer whose landlord provided salt as part of his lease, all of them were still legally obligated to purchase their annual allocation of government salt at the government price. The price was not incidental. In the Grandes Gabelles regions, the government salt price was set at a level estimated to be between 10 and 30 times the actual cost of production. The margin was pure fiscal extraction, and since salt was not optional, since the biology of the human body demanded it, the extraction was inescapable. In the pays rédhibitoires, the regions of Lesser Gabelle, the tax rate was lower. In certain provinces near the coast, particularly Brittany and parts of the southwest, historical exemptions meant the gabelle was effectively non-existent. The result was a geography of radical inequality. A coastal salt farmer in Brittany might produce salt at essentially no tax burden. 100 kilometers away, across an administrative boundary invisible on the landscape, a peasant farmer paid 30 times more for the same mineral. This created a smuggling industry of enormous scale and, eventually, enormous violence. The faux sauniers, the false salt dealers, the smugglers, operated throughout France in networks that at their peak in the 17th and 18th centuries employed tens of thousands of people. They were not criminals by temperament or profession. Most were farmers, tradespeople, desperate people who had calculated that the risk of smuggling salt across provincial boundaries was preferable to paying a tax that consumed a significant fraction of a family's annual income. They carried salt hidden in false-bottomed carts, inside clothing, buried under loads of hay, wrapped in oilskin beneath river barges. Women wrapped salt bricks in cloth and wore them strapped to their bodies beneath their skirts. Children carried salt in their pockets to school. The punishment for being caught was not a fine. The punishment was the galleys. France maintained a fleet of galley ships, oar-powered warships used in the Mediterranean, that required an enormous, constant supply of slave labor. The Galarians who powered these ships were overwhelmingly condemned criminals, and among the most numerous category of convicted criminals in 18th century France were salt smugglers. Historians estimate that between the late 1600s and the Revolution, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,500 people were condemned to the galleys for salt smuggling per year. A family man caught carrying 3 kilograms of untaxed salt across a provincial border could be separated from his wife and children and chained to a galley oar for 3 to 5 years. A repeat offender could receive a life sentence. In the Grenier Salle records and the court documents of the juridictions des gabelles, the special courts established specifically to prosecute salt crimes, the names accumulate with the quiet horror of an archive. Jean Moreau, peasant farmer, age 34, condemned to 5 years in the galleys for possession of 6 livres of untaxed salt. Marie Aubert, widow, age 52, publicly flogged and imprisoned for selling salt from a prohibited source. Pierre Duval, journeyman carpenter, age 27, condemned to the galleys for life for a third offense of salt smuggling. These were not exceptional cases. They were the routine output of a system designed to extract maximum revenue from minimum mercy. The exempt classes, the nobility, the clergy, certain categories of royal office holders, paid nothing, or paid at preferential rates, or received salt allocations as a perquisite of rank. The salt that a duke sprinkled on his venison at a Paris dinner party had cost him a fraction of what the same quantity cost the peasant farmer who had grown the grain that fed the duke's horses. The mineral was identical, the molecule was identical. The injustice was structural, deliberate, and centuries old. To understand what salt does, what it has always done, requires a brief descent into chemistry. But chemistry in this context is not an abstraction. It is an explanation of why control of this molecule was worth any cruelty that control required. Sodium chloride dissolves in water into its constituent ions, Na+ and Cl-. In the presence of food, meat, fish, vegetables, these ions perform 2 distinct functions simultaneously. First, osmosis. Salt draws moisture out of cellular tissue through the process of osmotic pressure. A piece of meat placed in brine loses water as the sodium chloride gradient pulls fluid across cell membranes and out into the surrounding solution. Bacteria that cause spoilage require moisture to survive and reproduce. Remove the moisture, and you remove the bacteria's operational environment. The food does not merely slow its decay, it stops decaying almost entirely. Second, direct antimicrobial action. The chloride ion in sufficient concentrations is directly toxic to many of the bacterial species responsible for food spoilage and foodborne illness. Clostridium botulinum, the organism responsible for botulism, one of the most lethal naturally occurring toxins, is effectively suppressed at salt concentrations above approximately 3.5%. Listeria monocytogenes, Salmonella typhimurium, and a range of other pathogenic organisms are similarly inhibited. Salt does not merely preserve food by removing water. It creates a chemical environment hostile to the organisms that would otherwise consume the food before humans can. This dual mechanism, osmotic dehydration combined with direct antimicrobial toxicity, is what made salt irreplaceable in every food culture on Earth before the development of mechanical refrigeration in the 19th century. It was not a preference or a tradition. It was the only available technology for keeping protein sources edible across time and distance. Every army that marched, every ship that sailed, every city that grew beyond the immediate reach of fresh food sources depended on salt-cured provisions. The molecule was not merely important, it was the enabling condition of organized human life at scale. The production of salt, accordingly, was never left to chance or to the unregulated market. Evaporation from seawater, solar evaporation in shallow salt pans, is the oldest and most widespread method of production. The basic technology is elegant in its simplicity. Seawater is channeled into a series of progressively shallower pools, where solar radiation and wind accelerate evaporation. As the concentration of dissolved salts rises, calcium carbonate and calcium sulfate precipitate out first, leaving behind an increasingly pure sodium chloride brine. In the final crystallization pond, the sodium chloride deposits as white crystals on the floor of the pan. Workers harvest this with wooden rakes, piling the crystals into mounds that glitter in the coastal sun like misplaced snowfall. But solar evaporation requires the right geography. Flat coastal land, adequate sun, low rainfall, consistent wind. It was unavailable to inland civilizations which developed alternative extraction methods at considerable human cost. Underground brine deposits, ancient dried seabeds whose remnant salt had dissolved into groundwater percolating through rock, were accessed through wells. The Chinese Xiajing, or self-flowing brine wells, of Sichuan reached extraordinary depths. The deepest recorded, the Shenhai well, drilled to approximately 1,001 meters by 1835, using only bamboo percussion tools and human labor. At that depth, the brine that rose to the surface was already under sufficient geological pressure to flow without pumping, hence the name. The brine was then boiled in large iron pans over fires fueled by natural gas, itself a byproduct of the drilling process, tapped through bamboo pipes from the same geological formation. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a remarkable feat of pre-industrial engineering. It was also, by the testimony of those who worked the wells, a reliable path to an early death. Lung disease from the boiling salt steam, burns from the gas fires, accidents in the shafts. The records of the Sichuan salt guilds list compensation payments to the families of dead workers with the same flat regularity as payments to suppliers of bamboo. Rock salt, halite, presented a third extraction method. In the great underground salt deposits of places like Wilicka in Poland, Salzburg in Austria, and the Kura mine in what is now Pakistan, miners worked in chambers carved entirely from solid salt in a darkness broken only by candle or oil lamp, breathing air laden with fine salt particles that settled in the lungs and slowly eroded them. The Wilicka mine, which began operation in the 13th century and is still accessible today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, extends to a depth of 327 meters across 9 levels and more than 245 kilometers of passages. The chambers are enormous, cathedrals of salt, their walls and ceilings carved by human hands over 7 centuries. Tourists who visit today describe them as breathtaking. The men who carved them described nothing. They were not given to description. They coughed and they worked and they died, and the salt came up regardless. On July 14th, 1789, a crowd stormed the Bastille in Paris. The history books record this as the opening act of the French Revolution, the moment when the accumulated rage of a taxed, hungry, humiliated population detonated against the symbols of royal power. Historians enumerate the causes: the fiscal crisis of the monarchy, the failure of the harvest of 1788, the political deadlock between the Estates General, the incompetence of Louis XVI's administration in the face of multiple simultaneous emergencies. The gabelle is rarely the headline, but it should be. In the months preceding the storming of the Bastille, one of the most consistently articulated grievances in the Cahiers de doléances, the formal lists of complaints compiled from every parish and guild in France as part of the convening of the Estates General, was the salt tax. The Cahiers from rural parishes in the Grands Gabelles regions describe the gabelle in language that ranges from precise economic complaint to something approaching raw grief. A parish in Burgundy describes families unable to properly preserve their pork for winter because the price of salt is beyond their reach, and the resulting loss of their provisions to spoilage. A guild in Normandy documents the imprisonment of 6 of its members for salt offenses in a single year. A village in the Loire Valley records that 3 of its men are currently serving galley sentences for salt smuggling, leaving their families dependent on parish charity. These were not abstract political grievances. They were biological. They were survival. The molecule that the body required, that the food required, that the winter required. This molecule had been placed behind a wall of fiscal extraction so high that ordinary people were committing crimes to reach it and going to the galleys when they were caught. The Constituent Assembly abolished the gabelle in 1790 to widespread celebration. Crowds in salt-taxed regions burned the official salt warehouses, the tax that had condemned thousands to the galleys, that had broken families across centuries, that had been called by Voltaire himself a tribute of tyranny, was gone. In its place, briefly, a revolutionary idea: salt would be free, or at least taxed modestly and equitably, like any other commodity. Napoleon reinstated the gabelle in 1806. He needed the revenue. He always needed the revenue. The wars required salt for the army's provisions, for the logistical chain that kept armies in the field. And the revenue from salt taxation was reliable, because salt was non-optional. He dressed the reinstatement in the neutral bureaucratic language of fiscal efficiency. The salt tax remained part of French fiscal policy until 1945, 155 years after the revolution promised to end it. On March 12, 1930, a 61-year-old man with a walking staff and a few dozen followers set out from his ashram in Sabarmati, in the Indian state of Gujarat, and began walking south toward the coast. 24 days and 388 kilometers later, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi reached the coastal village of Dandi. He bent down at the water's edge, picked up a small lump of natural salt from the mud, and held it up. The British Empire had a problem. India's salt was everywhere, in the coastal flats of Gujarat, in the vast salt lakes of Rajasthan, in the tidal marshes of Bengal. The subcontinent floated in salt. For centuries before British rule, Indian communities had harvested it freely, used it freely, traded it within local economies without significant restriction. Under British colonial administration, all of that ended. The Salt Act of 1882 prohibited Indians from collecting or selling salt independently. Every grain of salt consumed in India had to be purchased from British government sources, at a price elevated by both the cost of British administration and the deliberate policy of extracting maximum revenue from minimum expenditure. The tax was regressive in the most literal sense possible. The poorest populations, subsistence farmers, day laborers, the vast rural majority of India, consumed proportionally more of their income on salt than the wealthy. They were also the populations least able to absorb price increases and most dependent on salt for preserving the limited protein in their diet. The British knew this. The salt revenue figures were published annually in government reports, with the same calm administrative transparency that colonialism always mistook for governance. Gandhi understood what he was doing with extraordinary precision. He chose salt not because it was the most dramatic injustice of British colonial rule. It was not by a considerable distance. He chose it because it was universal. Every Indian, in every province, of every religion, caste, and class, consumed salt. Every Indian, in consuming salt, paid the tax. Every Indian, in paying the tax, financed the machinery of their own subjugation. To protest the salt tax was not to protest one injustice. It was to protest the structural logic of the entire colonial enterprise, using the most democratically available symbol imaginable. Within days of Gandhi's act at Dandi, salt acts of civil disobedience erupted across India. Coastal communities waded into the sea and harvested salt openly, defiantly, in full view of British authorities. Inland, people boiled seawater illegally. Markets began selling untaxed salt. The British response, mass arrests, police beatings, the imprisonment of over 60,000 people within months, generated exactly the international attention Gandhi had calculated it would. The American journalist Webb Miller reported on the police beatings of nonviolent protesters at the Dharasana Salt Works in May 1930, with a horror that circulated through newspapers worldwide. His description of protesters advancing in columns toward the salt works, being beaten to the ground and rising again, or being carried away unconscious, only for the next column to advance in silence without any attempt at resistance. This description entered the historical record and did not leave it. A mineral, two atoms, an ionic bond, and an empire momentarily forced to see what it had built. Today, salt is so cheap it is given away. Fast food restaurants place it in paper packets beside plastic straws. It costs less per kilogram than almost any other food ingredient. The price collapse began in the 19th century with the mechanization of salt production, the development of the Leblanc and Solvay processes for industrial salt manufacture, and the expansion of global shipping that made transportation costs negligible. Salt that Roman soldiers received as a significant portion of their pay now retails for pennies per kilo in any supermarket on Earth. And yet, the World Health Organization estimates that excessive sodium consumption kills approximately 1.89 million people per year globally. Not from deficiency, from excess. The biological imperative that drove human civilizations to control, tax, and fight over salt has been inverted by industrial food production into its opposite, a surfeit so overwhelming that the human body cannot regulate it. Approximately 75% of sodium consumed in modern Western diets comes not from the salt shaker, but from processed foods, bread, cheese, cured meat, canned goods, snack foods, where sodium is used not merely for preservation, but for flavor enhancement, texture modification, and the extension of shelf life beyond what any natural product could achieve. The food industry's relationship with sodium is not accidental. Salt suppresses bitterness in a way that allows manufacturers to reduce the quality of other ingredients without the consumer noticing. It triggers salivation and enhances the perception of other flavors, making mediocre food taste acceptable and acceptable food taste desirable. It binds water in processed meat products, increasing their weight and therefore their sale price. It is, in the language of food science, a multifunctional ingredient. In the language of public health, it is a slow-acting toxin embedded in the food supply at a scale that no individual consumer can meaningfully evade without deliberate and constant effort. The people who consume the most processed sodium today are, as they have always been, the people with the least capacity to avoid it. Cheap food is salt-heavy food. Fast food is salt-heavy food. The food available in neighborhoods without grocery stores, in food deserts, in communities where time and money preclude cooking from raw ingredients. This food is dense with sodium, and the health consequences are distributed accordingly. Hypertension, the primary cardiovascular consequence of chronic sodium overconsumption, kills disproportionately in low-income communities and communities of color in the United States. The epidemiology is not ambiguous. Salt built the hierarchies of the ancient world. Salt financed the armies that defended those hierarchies. Salt taxed the people at the bottom of those hierarchies until they smuggled it or starved, or rose up and burned the warehouses. And now, having been made cheap enough that no one fights over it anymore, salt has found a new mechanism of extraction. It is no longer taken from the poor as a price. It is given to the poor as an ingredient, embedded in the cheapest available food, and the cost is paid later, in hospitals, in dialysis centers, in the particular quiet of a cardiovascular ward at 4 in the morning. The molecule has not changed. 2 atoms, 1 bond. The geometry of the exploitation has simply been modernized.